uh, to plan what it would take to create what they call a digital edition, or making a lot of this material freely available on the web in an organized fashion. This grant category targeted African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native American history specifically. So I work with Frank, who I'll introduce in a minute, on the papers of William F. Cody, known as Buffalo Bill, a project that's centered at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. Many of you may have visited the 5 museums up there. But the papers project has over 1,000 items currently online, listed as having to do with Lakota performers, because Buffalo Bill, after the first few years of the Wild West show, almost exclusively recruited from the Pine Ridge area for his contracted performers that did travel all over, as Valerie said, the US and Europe between 1883 and 1915. By my count of places that they actually performed, over 3,115 places in the US and Europe and Canada they performed. And they had many more performances, because sometimes they did 2 a day and things like that. But they performed for such a wide audience that saw Lakota people demonstrating their life ways and their writing skills and shooting skills and their cultural kind of lifestyles in front of all these paying public across the US and Europe. So we're really excited to, we're in the 2nd year of the grant. And as Valerie stated, we're hoping to end this spring with a community scanning event where you would be able to bring items related to your ancestors who may have performed with Buffalo Bill, Wild West, or with any other Wild West performance. And we'd be happy to record your stories and scan or photograph your items and obviously give them right back to you, but have them contribute to this collection that scholars, citizens, anybody, just people, future generations will have at their fingertips. So you may know some of the well-known personal narratives of Lakota performers that have been published either in academic or popular press books about their experience traveling with Buffalo Bill. I think of Black Elk or Landing Bear, and their memoirs, their reminiscences that have been put in print have offered a window, into the Lakota experience with the Wild West. But I think it's fair to say that we don't really know a whole lot about the individual performers' thoughts about their time traveling and performing and things like that. We know Sitting Bull performed for 1 year and wasn't really interested in doing more than that. Other people signed up and did it year after year, and even worked with other Wild West shows after their time with Cody. So this is an interesting time period, the 1880s through the 19-teens. America went through, the Spanish-American War and World War I, and all kinds of things were happening in the US and Europe. But Buffalo Bill's Wild West and other imitator shows featured Native American performers, along with the cowboys and vaqueros and the sharpshooters, the roping and riding and all those kinds of activities. But they were a staple of the programs. So we're joined today by Professor Frank Christianson, who is in the English department at Brigham Young University. And as I said, he's the senior editor of the papers of William F. Cody, and he's edited Buffalo Bill's autobiography, the life of the Honorable William F. Cody. And he's also edited a book that Cody's attributed as author for called The Wild West in England. And Frank has spent quite a bit of time in England doing research for that and other projects. And we invited him today to give us a little insight into what he's discovered about, maybe more detail about Lakota performers with Cody in England, and then other thoughts and reflections on the kind of what his research is uncovering in a broader sense of the impact of Native Americans on European thought at the time. So welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Doug and Valerie. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, let me just maybe take a few minutes to build on what you said, Doug, and then maybe we can have a discussion about some of these themes. Yeah, as you mentioned, I've been involved with the Cody Papers Project for over a decade now, since around 2010. And I kind of came to this world with a background in literary and cultural history of the 19th century, and a particular interest in things transatlantic. So the way that American culture influenced and was influenced by European culture in particular. And so as I learned more about the history of the Wild West exhibition and especially the years it spent abroad, I thought it represented a really kind of powerful and interesting case study for how people thought about what it meant to be an American during these years. And so I've worked on these autobiographical writings and then been involved in some other projects that explore this in more detail, especially just the idea of the Wild West as an American cultural export. And the Lakota performers have a particular significance when we study that phenomenon and ask those larger questions about American identity on an international stage. So yeah, by way of offering a little more context, this research begins with the Wild West as, in the form it had arrived at in the spring of 1887. That year, the organizers went back to Pine Ridge and recruited participants for something new, because they had been touring for 4 years up to that point, all around, particularly in the eastern U.S. But this was a chance to go abroad, and so that meant a very different kind of opportunity, and that I think was appealing to some of the past performers, and others less so, because that was definitely a new horizon for really everybody. And so they were able to recruit a full contingent of Lakota performers who, in many cases, brought along families, and launched this first international tour, which began with a 6-month stand in London as part of something called the American Exhibition, which was kind of like a World's Fair. And then they spent another 6 months in northern England, in Birmingham and in Manchester, before returning that spring, and kind of regrouping for a year. They were so successful on that tour that they saw new possibilities in Europe, and that was a springboard for a more extended traveling exhibition across the European continent, beginning with the Paris World's Fair in 1889. And altogether, they spent almost 7 years in Europe over these multiple extended tours. So just kind of looking at the state of the show and the role of the Lakota performers in it, by this point, it was a pretty well-oiled machine. Like I said, they've been touring for about 4 years, and they had their program, their set list down pretty well and without much variation, except for a few exceptions. And as I kind of analyzed that, the Lakota performers, there were kind of 4 different categories of involvement. They were a key through line. I think they were the most consistent element of the show from beginning to end. It could be as much as a 3-hour extravaganza with many different elements and fast moving. But there always seemed to be Lakota on the showground, depending on what they were doing. So, the first and probably the most well-known is that they were essentially action actors, as we think about action film today, in which they were performing as typically antagonists in a series of stage conflicts. So things such as chasing Pony Express riders, attacks on settlers' cabins or a stagecoach, and later it would be involved in recreations of actual historical battles. So that was one kind of main category. Another was participating in actual competitions. So they had a foot race between the Lakota and some Mexican vaqueros and some cowboys, and this was an actual competition that they would have near the beginning of the exhibition each time. Also, a pony race with young Indian riders, and audience members were encouraged to choose a favorite and root for them. So, performing feats of athletic or horsemanship accomplishment. And then another category was essentially, you could call it exhibiting. Some, forms of kind of ethnographic display. One was called Phases of Indian Life. It involved setting up a small Indian encampment, like literally, live in front of the audience, creating the encampment and then going about and kind of reenacting many of the daily tasks of domestic life. And they would usually culminate this in some kind of traditional dance, like a war dance. They'd also were involved in dramatizing a buffalo hunt. So again, right there in the arena, an actual herd of buffalo, although this one didn't have real consequences for the buffalo. They would have blanks in their guns, but chasing the buffalo around the arena for an audience to give them a sense of what that might have been like. And then, ultimately, that's kind of covers the categories of their participation in the exhibition on the arena, but it didn't end there. The showground extended to the actual encampment, which was open to a paying public. And so thousands milled around the living quarters of the Lakota during their off hours and had a chance to interact with them. So, pretty central in those ways. And we can think more about how they were central to the perception of the Wild West exhibition and the claims it made for itself, and that were key to its success over so many years. But, it's also interesting to think about their motives for participation. I think, essentially there was a better wage there. Economic opportunities on Pine Ridge could be quite limited. And so this was a chance to earn some real money that could benefit them and their families. It was a chance to see the world. Another aspect of life on Pine Ridge was highly restricted and limited in their mobility. And this was a way to get out and see other parts of the country and then eventually Europe as well. There were also some chances to advocate for Indian causes, and then ultimately, maybe ironically, a chance to preserve some of their traditions that might have been prescribed or again limited in terms of what they could do at Pine Ridge, that they could do in performance, like a war dance, in front of audiences of tens of thousands, as they toured around. So their interests and their motives were their own, but there you could see a number of reasons why it might have been an attractive opportunity for these performers. So maybe I'll just pause there, Doug, and there are some things we could talk about in terms of public perceptions of the Wild West performers, and then think about maybe some of the actual participants and their circumstances.
Yeah, that's great. You just prompted me to think about when you were going through the program. It's interesting that the show, like you say, could be up to 3-hour show, culminates really with those two big events: the buffalo hunt, as in the program it referred to it as genuine buffalo hunt by Buffalo Bill and the Indians, and then at least in 1883, for Queen Victoria in London, it was an attack on the settlers' cabin, and it says in the program, by hostile Indians repulsed by cowboys under the leadership of Buffalo Bill. So when we think about the historical context, speaking as a historian of the American West here, we know that these performances, this exhibition that's being taken around the United States and Europe, has its as its context. It emerges right at the end of the U.S. military's campaigns against Plains Indians and the forced settlement on reservations and things like that we're familiar with. So exhibitions like this, are in some ways we can see them being attuned to that moment and capitalizing, maybe financially, literally, on what some scholars have described as a public nostalgia for a past that has disappeared, right? And so what this vanishing American frontier that was full in their minds, their popular conceptions of cowboys everywhere and Indians and railroads and gold mines and all these kinds of things, that was disappearing. And one would argue that the Native Americans, in this case the Lakota performers, are at the center of that popular imagination. And I forgot in my introduction of your accomplishments, I forgot the Popular Frontier, the book you edited about these things in a transnational way, with essays on Italy and Germany and England and France and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of interesting that Cody, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, is certainly the most prominent and the longest running Wild West show, although I said, as they said, they had 100+ imitators, some that lasted a year or some that lasted a little bit longer. But in your final comments, you were kind of saying how the Lakota performers were able to get something out of it. Cody's getting something out of it, and maybe there's a moment where the two intertwine or overlap. But I don't know if you have, if there's further thoughts on that moment in time, certainly in American history and literature, but also in European thought and culture of America and the West.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the ways that their interests would have overlapped, because the temptation might be to think that from Cody's perspective, this would be about purely about making money, and certainly to some degree it was, and that would work at cross purposes with, for example, the Lakota's interest in preserving their culture, because this, of course, is being repackaged as a commercial product. However, it was transcendently important to the Wild West exhibition's popular appeal that they present a convincing representation of Native American life. And so they actually went to great lengths to offer something that seemed as authentic as possible. And that meant, everything from, the ways that the Lakota represented themselves in the arena, to the ways that they were, the freedom they were given to, how they set up their encampment. And as I said, that was something that public had access to. And so how they, conducted themselves in that space, they were encouraged to be, situate themselves as comfortably and as familiarly as they could. So, yeah, it's an interesting question, how their interests converged in this enterprise. The other thing I should note, going back to those different categories of participation in the show, you'd think that the more sensational elements, the staged conflicts, would be what really draws the crowd's interests and maybe lingers in their memories. But there's quite a bit of press coverage that expresses a deeper interest in the more ethnographic side of things, and the less dramatic depictions of Indian village life and the buffalo hunt, that rather than what could be kind of repetitive and somewhat gratuitous violence of those conflict scenes. And so that's just an interesting, and that of course plays out in different ways in different parts of Europe as they're touring around. But that's an interesting aspect of some of the press coverage. Just another thought about to think about public perceptions. There's a clear sense from the promotional materials and show programming on the one hand, that and then the newspaper coverage and personal audience accounts on the other, that Lakota performers were foundational to the Wild West claims for itself as a realistic representation of life on the American frontier. So essentially they were saying, in the ways that the Wild West promoted itself, its central argument was, we have actual Native Americans with us. And that message was heard by their audiences, such that they believed and accepted the authenticity of the Wild West because of that presence. So, another way to put that is that the Lakota made the Wild West more American to a British audience. They were the thing that made it most American.
Yeah, and that's something. Something that we've talked about the influence on the British reading public of the ideas of the West. Go back to James Fenimore Cooper and Last of the Mohicans, and that whole Leatherstocking saga of 5 books about upstate New York. Iroquois folk and others, but they were ready to receive a program, a live exhibition that featured Native Americans in those kinds of activities, right?
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because I was thinking about that this week and had a chance to visit the National Museum of the American Indian here in DC, where I'm spending some time doing some research and other work. And they have a permanent exhibit there simply titled Americans. And it highlights the ways that American Indians have been part of the nation's identity since before the country began, through their representations in popular culture. And it's just interesting to, the sort of caption that describes the exhibition says that pervasive, powerful, at times demeaning, the images, names, and stories reveal the deep connection between Americans and American Indians, as well as how Indians have been embedded in unexpected ways in the history, popular culture, and identity of the United States. So it's kind of a fascinating, immersive exhibit that just shows you the extraordinary array and variety of ways that Indigenous communities have, found their way into and been represented in American culture. And not surprisingly, Buffalo Bill's Wild West appears multiple times in that. There are at least 4 different show posters from different periods in the history of the exhibition that are part of that exhibit. Yeah, so I mean, something else you raised, I think it is interesting though to think about in that sort of role of being the touchstone for authenticity with the Wild West, and that has kind of special or a different set of implications maybe when they're outside the United States. But one of the tensions in requiring the Lakota to fulfill this key role was that they had to be both individually distinctive and broadly representative at the same time. So, like on the one hand, the show went to great lengths to celebrate individual performers, especially with photographs as cabinet card images. The photography of the show Indians is one of the exhibition's really important legacies, as it captures them as individuals with culturally faithful costuming and other things. But on the other hand, they tend to be less concerned with things like accurate labels in the show program. Which tribe does an individual belong to? Is somebody actually a chief? They tended to overuse that term, I think, again, because they thought that would be, or heighten their appeal. So they were both individual and still having to, represent a certain type that would make sense to this broader public. And again, that translates in different ways in different contexts as they move about Europe.
Yeah, and then that, as noted, certainly in the Popular Frontier edited book, it changes from place to place, and what different messages they received prior to the visit of Buffalo Bill's Wild West about Native Americans, certainly Plains Indians in particular, but also vaqueros, cowboys, women, sharpshooters, all the kinds of things that Cody had that kind of either bucked the norm or in his mind, as you said, represented the authentic West that had passed or was at this moment passing, and treading, leveraging that nostalgia of, I bring you all the way to Germany, all the way to England. I bring you the authentic people of the West, chief, whoever, and stuff like that. And even the activities they're doing, Cody and the Wild West are credited with kind of the proto rodeo, right? Bringing, some of those kinds of skills that he would argue or, present as being very common in a West are very foreign to urban audience members, right? Who
Right.
know how to milk a cow or certainly rope a bucking bronco or something like that, or a bison. So, but there's also that exotic nature too. I was always surprised that he brought along overseas not just the bison and all the horses, but they brought elk, right?
Yeah.
Kind of exotic creatures like that too, to just have showing, like I said, an urban audience in most cases, or at least an audience unfamiliar with those kinds of things. So you think of the context of the cabinets of curiosities, the early museums that had kind of a thin line between sideshows and museums at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, the popular, I think that's what I'm kind of getting at now, is how does somebody like you study a popular conception or reception of these kinds of presentations? What stays in a, I don't know, an academic or culturally elite realm, and what transcends that into popular imagination?
Yeah, I mean, it's just in the way you're talking about it. It's a reminder that it's a challenge, and in some ways impossible to imagine, and maybe overstate just what the experience would have been like, especially for Europeans, to attend this exhibition. It was because they, of course, went to extraordinary lengths to provide a setting for the kinds of things you were describing, in terms of these, again, authentic frontier figures, and then the menagerie of a kind of moving zoo of frontier animal life, and including literally building mountains on a showground and creating vast painted backdrops and planting thousands of plants, so that an audience in the stands has literally been transported to this other world. And it's in that context that they can tell this kind of larger story, that is, yes, it's exotic, yes, it's entertaining, but it also, in a fascinating ways, found its way into larger narratives that made sense to these audiences. And so for the British, it's particularly interesting to study that first tour in 1887, because it coincides with a really important milestone in British cultural life, which was the jubilee of Queen Victoria's reign. So she'd been on the throne for 50 years at this point, and there was a lot of pageantry and pomp and circumstance around the British royal family, and so it's a period of high nationalism for them, and a lot of ritual and celebration around the idea of Englishness. But that idea can't be separated from the colonial history that had been so central to their national development over the last 150 years or more, but especially during Victoria's reign. And so you see, in the press, and the popular press, lots of references to the specific features of the show and kind of larger message of the show as a story of Anglo-Saxon conquest, and that this essentially looks like another chapter in the history of Britain's expanding influence in the world, or the expanding influence of English-speaking peoples. And so the Lakota performers are kind of wrapped into that as a part of a set of colonial subjects. And you see this really in marked ways by contrast, or in comparison to another exhibit that had taken place the year before, the Colonial and Indian exhibition, that had again, had been kind of like a World's Fair, an exhibition of British colonial life outside of Britain, with a particular focus on India, the people and cultures and products of India. And so those were the East Indians. And then you see in the press and in even places like Queen Victoria's journal, after she attends a command performance and meets with some of the performers, and she clearly sees this other group of people. She refers to them as the Red Indians, but they are in contrast to the East Indians of India. These are the Red Indians of the American West, right? But they're part of a kind of common grouping of subjects, right? So yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, let's maybe transition to some of the more individual stories or things you've uncovered from your research in England of the performers. I know, I've read about sometimes folks stayed there, they married, or some perished, died and are buried in Europe. Others just wanted to stay. Sometimes they'd marry, like I said, and then they'd come back home with a European wife to the reservation. There's a lot of different, I guess a lot of variety to that. We've heard of Cody footing the bill for, a ticket home on the boat for those who are homesick or something like that. And I think it was it Black Elk even who got lost for a year or something and reunited with Cody the next time the show came over there. But what have you uncovered more of those, moving from the big cultural stories now down to the personal biographical things?
Yeah, it's both interesting and challenging to try to follow some of these threads and just to underscore what you and Valerie were saying at the beginning. I mean, it also is, that question is the inspiration for this initiative, isn't it? Because for so many of these, those that were involved from Pine Ridge, we don't have as much or much information at all, and the hope is that there's an opportunity to through oral histories, through families, family memories and traditions, not just identify performers, but learn more details about their lives before, during, or after, and hopefully get a better sense of how their experiences impacted their families and what kind of legacy there is. Because like you said, there's beyond those memoirs by Black Elk and Luther Standing Bear, there isn't much in the way of firsthand accounts. And in the absence of firsthand accounts, what you tend to get is information through the eyes of, somebody else, whether that's audiences or the press or show producers. And those lenses always, impact what we think we can understand about their circumstances. So, when we think about that first tour, the best known participant was Red Shirt, who was designated chief of the Show Indians, and he gets featured a lot in connection with British dignitaries. So he has a personal audience with Queen Victoria, with Prince Albert, with Prime Minister William Gladstone, and there's a lot of coverage of him or a cohort touring around London. Especially that idea of a cultural encounter is particularly fascinating to the British public. So, the first time that the Show Indians, attend like a Shakespeare play or go to some other cultural event, there's always interest in how they respond to those kinds of experiences. And then there are other people that are featured. We know through some of the studio photography, figures such as Blue Horse, Flies Above, Good Eagle, Little Bull, Little Chief, all are people we know exist because of that photographic record, but we don't know much more about their lives beyond the show. And then, another category are these mixed heritage families, like John Y. Nelson, the stagecoach driver and interpreter, his wife, Jenny Lone Wolf, and they had 5 children. They get a lot of attention because they are photographed frequently. His children participated in the performances as well. Bronco Bill Irving is another one. His wife, he was another interpreter for the show, and his wife Ella Bessonette, and they had a son who was also involved in the performance. And you mentioned, another aspect of this is those that were left behind. So some released themselves on their own recognizance. There was a lot more movement than I realized before I started to study this, in terms of performers deciding they wanted to go home or needed to because of some compelling circumstance. Others that maybe got left behind and migrated to other traveling Wild West shows. And then those that were left behind because they passed away. And that continues to be a story that, even within fairly well, within the last few decades, in Britain in particular, there's a cemetery in West Central Britain called Brompton Cemetery. And we know of at least one or two examples of performers who passed away. Chief Long Wolf, who died of pneumonia. He was the oldest performer during the 1892 tour. He died at age 59 of pneumonia, and was buried there in Brompton Cemetery. And then in that same site, a young child named Star fell from a horse and died from her injuries, and she was buried there. And they were only identified and repatriated in 1997. Their remains were brought back to Pine Ridge and buried at Wolf Creek Cemetery. And there's some interesting coverage of that event. Actually, if you go to Britain, the British Film Institute has a film record of the ceremony, the burial ceremony in 1892. Just a silent film of the procession, and then there's a lot of coverage about the repatriation, and some of our audience may remember that event. Some of Long Wolf's descendants, his granddaughter Jessie Blackfeather and his great grandson John Blackfeather were played a key role in that. But there are also some mysteries that remain even in that cemetery. 2 other performers in 1887 who died of lung infections, surrounded by the enemy and Paul Eagle Star. We have a record that they were buried there, but their graves were unmarked, and so that's and we don't know much. We don't know any other details about them, except that that's where they remain, and so there's less possibility of repatriation on that front. So it's just these little tidbits and little details about people's lives and circumstances that it would be, it represents or points to some of the ways that hopefully the Lakota community can, still contribute to our understanding of these people's lives and their legacies.
Yeah, that's great. That's sometimes we presume a lot of the record from the past exists. It just needs to be located, but a lot of times it doesn't exist. We do the best we can with what we have and try to fill in the gaps with educated guesses and things like that. And so it is important to have the opportunity to create archival material. And as we reach the top of the hour here, I'm just thinking that, to kind of underscore the mission of the grant again, which is to work, from the community to identify the kinds of stories, the kinds of objects, artifacts, documents from the past that they want to save and archive and then share in these organized digital collections on different themes. We just started with the Lakota performers because we had a lot of material on it and a lot of unknown things. Those 1,000 items I mentioned in the Cody archive, a lot of the photographs are only identified as, like, say, Lakota man. There's no description of what they're wearing or what they're holding or what they're doing in these photographs. Some of course are posed, like you mentioned. The cabinet cards were sold at the show as collector's items, like programs and memorabilia. So they're staged in a studio, photographic studio, and sold by the thousands, I'm sure. But then others are candids, and they're, you see them either in their show attire, or maybe it's clothing they brought with them, and that was part of why they were hired, is because they were able to have a full set of clothing or costuming that would, be part of the show. But I think it's really important that we ask the community, what is it that you want to share about this topic? And going forward, Valerie can probably speak to this directly too, about other themes or topics that are of interest to the community that the library might be able to organize a digital exhibit around, or even a physical exhibit. But veterans issues, experiences, women, and material culture. There's a lot of different things that could be done in the future, but this is kind of a pilot project, a little proof of concept, if you will, to see if what we can do with it. But we think we hope that there's some interesting stories out there that the listening audience, may have heard from a grandparent or a great grandparent, and maybe some objects in a shoebox somewhere, photographs or things like that. But
yeah.
Yeah. No. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Frank. Sorry.
Oh, I'm just a quick add on to that. It's just, when you say stories, and I think even just fragments of stories, that there's a larger history story here, and so even if just somebody has brief remembrances, when those things start to get put together, they can make connections across different gaps and offer a more complete portrait of this particular history.
So the mission of the archives and library, including with this grant and this project, is that we are the knowledge keepers and the story keepers of the tribe. And we're trying to just gather information and have it for future generations. It's about giving names and voices to our people and giving those stories so that those legacies can continue into the future generations. And so if you guys have stories about the Wild West show or different topics that you guys would like to share, We like doing things about traditional plants and other things, but focusing on the Wild West show, we are trying to see if anyone has any photos, information, like Doug said, about their ancestors that were part of this. And we would just take scans and hand the items right back to you. And if you guys have any stories or want to participate in this project, you can give us a call at 605-455-6065. And you can contact us through the library and archives at the Oglala Lakota College.
That's great. Well, this has been really fun. Thank you, Frank, for joining us. And this is our 10th show, I guess. Thanks to KILI Radio for collaborating with us on this important, I think, important project. Yes, and look for more information in the future about the public scanning event in the spring. But like Valerie said, if you have any questions or want to participate somehow, whether you have a story about Lakota performers in Wild West shows or not, contact the archives and library there at Oglala Lakota College, and we'd love to collaborate.
Thank you, Frank, for joining us today, and thank you for the audience for listening to us, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that.
Terrific. You want to give the phone number one more time?
So our phone number is 605-455-6065. I'm Valerie Janis, the archivist, and the assistant archivist is Elena Cineros.
Super.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.